We're excited to open CMMC Con 2022 with results from a first ever independent study conducted by Merrill Research on the state of the DIB in regard to CMMC compliance, presented by Eric Noonan, Cybersheath CEO and founder. Cybersheath is recognized as the leading managed CMMC compliance company. Cybersheath's experience stretches back to 2008. That's when all of this started as a voluntary pilot program. In his former position as BAE Systems Chief Information Security Officer, Eric Noonan was one of the very first members of the Department of Defense pilot program to secure their commercial supply chain. He testified before the House Armed Services Committee subcommittee on how those efforts would impact defense contractors. Nearly 15 years after the voluntary pilot program kicked off, contractors are eager to understand how they compare to their peers. So to kick off CMMC Con, Eric will share some of the first ever independent research data collected to paint a picture of the current DIB compliance landscape.
Good morning again. It's great to be here with you today, and as I mentioned in my opening remarks earlier, I'm going to be talking about the state of the DIB in today's discussion, and I want to share really my personal perspective on how far we truly have come these last 15 years or so, at least in my personal involvement with the public-private partnership between prime and subcontractors in the Department of Defense. We've really kind of moved through many phases together, and I think there's always a need to move faster and always a need to move more quickly in terms of the progress we're making so that we can be more secure. There's a lot of things to be proud of, and I don't think you in the audience who have been part of this or those at the Department of Defense should lose sight of the work that's been done and the progress that's been made. And so, we've kind of moved through some phases as a public-private partnership. Really, it was the forming, storming, norming, performing journey, if you're familiar with that. And make no mistake, in many ways, it's often unreported and unheralded, but the Department of Defense and industry in this partnership are in fact performing. And I want to cover three specific areas that I want to point to where I think there's been a tremendous amount of performance and a tremendous amount of progress, supported by some independent research that was done by Merrill in their research department. And I'm going to share some of the statistics. We'll be releasing the full research, first ever research done, in this industry relative to the Department of Defense, prime and subcontractors complying with CMMC and these regulations. So you've never heard some of these statistics before in a way that they're going to be presented today. And then when we release the full research, I think you'll be really blown away by it. But it confirms some things and some of the progress that we've made. And so for one of the things, and I'll tie this back to my personal involvement in journey and the Cybersheath journey, having gone from a global chief information security officer charged with making sense of these requirements in the early days to a managed compliance provider trying to assist companies in getting fully compliant. And so the three things that I want to go through that I think we should all be very proud of in our contributions relative to CMMC is we've got a common language now and a common measurement relative to compliance and operational security, and that baseline mandatory minimums that we have to meet, which is all known as NIST 800-171. So we didn't have that when we first started. So many years ago, 2008, 2009, when what is now known and taken for granted as CMMC, there was no CMMC. There was no NIST 800-171. All we had was a call to action. And there was a time in 2008 where Deputy Secretary of Defense at the time, Gordon England, called 8 of the largest prime contractors in the United States to the Pentagon and essentially said, stop the bleeding. We're losing our intellectual property, and much of it sits on your networks, you being the contractors. And we have to work together to fix this. And that was the original call to action. And having been part of that group, you can imagine some of the reactions, right? So some of the larger prime defense contractors at the time felt we understand cybersecurity, we understand the threat, and we're better than the government in many cases in terms of our ability to detect and respond to these threats. There was almost a hubris in some domains relative to ability to detect and respond to threats. There were lots of legal concerns relative to, well, if I start sharing intelligence with the Defense Department, my largest customer, how is that, and can I even share that information? Number one. Number two, is it going to be used against me in an adverse way on contracts, future contract awards? So there was operational concerns, legal concerns. How do we actually share information? There was no networks to be able to do that, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And so we really didn't have a common language or a common baseline. We were starting from nowhere. The MITRE attack framework, NIST 800-171, CMMC, none of those things existed at the time. So it was just a bunch of smart people in a room looking at each other, all trying to figure out how do we communicate together. And I think one of the things we should be incredibly proud of now as part of this public-private partnership, imperfections and all, is that we now have a common language and measurement, and it's known as NIST 800-171. So we have that baseline, and we've had it since 2015. The great irony, when I have customers or potential customers or peers or anybody ask me about, well, when will CMMC become mandatory? When do I really have to do this? The great irony in all that is the fact that if you had met compliance when it was originally proposed in 2015 timeframe, if you had achieved compliance with NIST 800-171, then you'd actually be fully compliant with CMMC 2.0 now. So had you met the original requirements 7 years ago, you would just still be maintaining compliance today. And I think that's a tip of the hat, frankly, to the Department of Defense for the continuity we've seen there relative to picking a standard, imperfect as it is, and there's many critics, but it's a standard, and they picked one and they've stuck with it. And so there's a lot of consistency there. The other thing that I think is meaningful in terms of performance is the fact that the ability to share threat information and incident reporting between industry and the Department of Defense. And we saw that, I think, in a very meaningful way with CISA here this year relative to the attacks in Ukraine and many of the attacks we've seen on critical infrastructure. We now have the plumbing to share this information in real time. When I was a global CISO and it was first proposed to share threat information between private industry and the Department of Defense, there was no mechanism to do it. There was no common computer infrastructure to do it. There wasn't a taxonomy on how we talked about these threats. We didn't have products in terms of how do we package this threat information and share it. So quite literally, when I was with BAE Systems and in that role, and the first set of threat information we received from DoD, it was literally FedEx. And we literally got hard copies of threat information, and that was the first step. And just like today, there were many who kind of turned their nose up at it and looked down at the effort and said, this isn't useful and it's hard copy. But it was the first step. And ultimately, as you navigate your journey to compliance, it's going to be many steps, but you have to take the first step. We eventually graduated from FedEx hard copy threat information to multiple active networks and the ability to report threat incidents online through the Defense Cybercrime Center and report that online securely and get real-time feedback. And in fact, one of the other enhancements to threat information and intelligence sharing were all these operational working groups and classified sessions that were stood up at the same time to further share information and context, and really built out a national infrastructure to be able to report and share this information. So it's another thing that often unheralded, where we've come a tremendously long way in our ability to share threat information and incident reporting. And then finally, I think we have a way to look at the problem of compliance and cybersecurity. and they're very much related. Now, you'll hear people say, that little catchphrase of just because you're compliant doesn't mean you're secure. Certainly that's true. But one of the wonderful things about NIST 800-171, I believe, is that if you're doing all of the things in NIST 800-171 and meeting all 110 of those controls, you're doing a pretty good job at cybersecurity. And I'm going to share some data with you here in a minute that indicates if you're doing that, you're an outlier and you're far ahead of the curve relative to many of your peers. So one of the things that I think is very important is that we now have actually a way, a rubric, if you will, to address the problem of both compliance and cybersecurity. So I think, again, tip of the hat to, frankly, the DoD and industry who've worked together for so long. Way back when this program first started, Victoria Morgan was the focal point within the Department of Defense, and she really moved mountains to pull industry, who was pretty reluctant back in the 2008, 9, 10 timeframe. They were reluctant to share information. They were reluctant to measure themselves relative to cybersecurity. So as you all know today, you have to do a self-assessment relative to NIST 800-171 and your compliance with it. Well, back then we didn't have that. We literally had a subset of NIST 853 of controls that we had to meet. And the Department of Defense asked for assessments. They had no way to compel it because the laws hadn't changed at that point. So they literally asked to do a self-assessment. And many companies bucked the trend and refused to do it. I was fortunate enough to be part of a leadership team with a board who gave me incredible support and wanted to lean into the requirement and do the assessment. And so what I did is what many of you are doing today. I look to a third party to say, I can't assess myself. That just intuitively doesn't make any sense. So I reached out, I found a third party. There was no such thing as a CMMC or a NIST 800-171 assessment at that time. So we took NIST 853. There was no scoring methodology, didn't exist. So where today you can, maybe complain or critique the scoring methodology that we use for NIST 800-171 when we do SPRS submissions, but we didn't even have that back then. We had to come up with our own, and we did. We did the work to come up with our own scoring methodology, and we actually did the first ever, what is now known as a self-assessment relative to 800-171. And we did that, and I presented it to the board, and I said, here was our methodology. Here's how we did it. Now, fast forward today, we have a way to kind of not only assess, but to assess where we are relative to compliance against NIST 800-171, a methodical, programmatic way to implement the controls that are non-compliant, and then for the maturity piece of it to continue to perform, we have a way to manage ongoing compliance. So we've gone in 15 years, and again, I wish it had been faster, I wish it had been less expensive, I wish it had been easier, all those things. But we should take a minute to celebrate our progress collectively in this public-private partnership, because we now have a way to assess, implement, and manage our ability to be compliant with NIST 800-171. So I think it's important to appreciate that. Now, while we've made a lot of progress, I mentioned earlier some research that we did with Merrill Research. You may or may not be surprised to find that progress has been very uneven. And I think while we now have, again, that common language, we now have the infrastructure to share threat information, we now have a way to measure ourselves against compliance. And so we really can't say as an industry that we don't know what we need to do. We can potentially say that we don't know when we need to do it by, but we actually know very clearly what we need to do. We know how to do it. There's very clear implementation best practices and vendors who will help you with implementing multi-factor authentication, implementing a SIM, implementing an EDR solution. So there's all kinds of implementation guidance, and we know how to measure success and create the artifacts to prove continuous compliance. So we've kind of got the whole playbook now. And I think we should all be very proud of our hopeful contributions to that process. But again, progress has been very uneven to date. So in 2022, Cybersheet commissioned a research project and study to better understand CMMC compliance progress to date. And I think many of you won't be surprised by the findings, but the findings show that in terms of full compliance and actual implementation of NIST 800-171, the companies who have fully implemented this, compliance framework that's been around since 2015 are few and far between. And so what we found when Merrill Research did their study, their independent study, again, there was no thumb on the scale. It was, find the sample size. And when we released the research, again, I think that you'll find it to be very valuable, because one of the questions that I often hear from companies is, well, what is company X doing relative to CMMC? Where do I fall against my peers? How can I baseline myself against my competitors? Now, I understand the question because I faced those very same questions from my board many years ago when the question was, well, what is Prime X doing? What is Prime Y doing? How much do they spend on cybersecurity? And even then, I knew those questions were interesting but irrelevant. It really doesn't matter. It's apples and oranges, but it's data boards want because they're trying to get their arms around the problem and understand how they compare, frankly, to their peers and where they need to make some investment and how quickly. So I think this research report that we're going to release will be very interesting to you to help have those conversations with your senior leadership teams and your board. So one of the things we found is that, federal prime contractors and subcontractors, so we looked at primes and subs, or Merrill did, and only 60% of the primes and subs pulsed had completed a system security plan. So as you know, if you've been in this space for a while, one of the requirements is, and you're asked right in SPRS, when you go into SPRS and you put your entry in there, they're going to ask you if you've completed your system security plan. We found that a full 40% of surveyed respondents had not done a system security plan. So I will tell you, having been in this space for a long time and gone through this full journey with the DoD, you can't be compliant without a system security plan. And it's just foundational. So that tells us that, you're just kind of knocked out of the game if you don't have that document. Now, relative to plan of action and milestones, if you remember way back in 2015, when the DFARS was first published, you were allowed to have a POAM, plan of action and milestone, which basically was a corrective action plan, right? One of the challenges, and I'll try and always be careful to articulate the acronyms, is just this kind of jargon that's grown up within this, compliance framework. And so POAMs, basically your corrective action plan, right? So when you do your assessment, you measure yourself against 110 security controls. For the ones that you're not compliant with, you need a plan of action and set of milestones to get fully compliant. We found that only 53% of surveyed respondents had POAMs. And then naturally, if you've been doing this for a little while, you might ask yourself, well, of the 53%, how's that going? Because remember, POAMs were required way back in 2015. So if you had written a POAM in 2015 and you're still working on that same POAM 7 years later, it might suggest that it's not getting the resources or the time and attention required. So that was pretty interesting. Only 46% of respondents had actually entered an SPRS score. So that was very surprising, I think, to our team in terms of, because when we talk to customers looking for a managed compliance solution for CMMC and they reach out to Cybersheet, many of them tell us almost, a high degree, not quite all, but many tell us that they've already entered their scores in SPRS. They don't feel very confident about the scores they've entered. They're uncomfortable with the scores they've entered, partly because they've done it themselves, which again, as I shared with you earlier, when I was a chief information security officer, one of the things I knew we couldn't do was assess ourselves. It just didn't make sense. I didn't think we could grade ourselves fairly. I didn't think we had the resources to divert and go do it. And I also didn't think it would have the same credibility when I shared the results with the senior leadership team and the board. So it was important for me, having been in your shoes, to find a third party to do that gap assessment. So we found that 46% had actually entered an SPRS score. Anecdotally, again, my experience, what I'm told from customers we speak to, it's a much, much higher percentage. And the scores are very high, but they don't have the confidence behind the fidelity of the scoring. We found that only 42% of respondents conducted an annual incident response exercise. Now, this is critically important. I've had just so many conversations over the years who said, what's the value of doing an incident response exercise? What really am I going to gain from that? I need to do actual work. I need to actually be looking for threats. I need to be responding to threats. But there's tremendous value in the lessons learned. And we frequently do them with our customers where they have to think through in advance. Well, what is my incident response plan? Who gets notified? When do they get notified? Who do they notify? How do I get in touch with the communications team, with the executive team, with the chief legal officer, et cetera? What are the mechanics and the logistics of doing that? And then how do I check in with those stakeholders as I move through the incident response process? So there's great value in doing that in times of quiet versus learning under incredible stress and duress. And we found, again, only 42% of responding companies had done that and actually conducted an annual incident response exercise, which is a requirement, but it's not one that's being met by even the majority of respondents in our survey. As far as a DFARS assessment, we recommend doing that annually. It just makes sense. It's kind of like an annual checkup. If you get, use any analogy you like, whether it's your inspection sticker on your car, your annual health checkup. But look, I think we all know cybersecurity is a domain that changes rapidly, frequently, and it's only increasing. And one of the challenges with CMMC is you have the regulatory piece. We have to distill and translate all this language and acronyms. Then you have the technical piece that is both IT in terms of patching and vulnerability management and asset inventory. And then you also have the cybersecurity piece, which brings a whole nother set of technologies and acronyms. So it's very, very difficult. And it changes frequently, as you've seen from CMMC 1.0 to 2.0. And so doing an annual DFARS assessment, we think makes great sense. We found only 40% of respondents actually did that. Now, in terms of what we did see some uptick with was companies who recognized the requirement for SPRS. And they were concerned. And the number one concern really was that CMMC would stand in the way of revenue. So we gave options. And when you see the full research and we released that, you'll see that we gave the ability to respond in terms of national security concerns, operational security concerns. But the number one concern really was the inability to continue to win Department of Defense related revenue. That was really the number one concern. And so there was somewhat of a movement to go find software packages to help with automating the assessment. Now, I think there's great value in doing that for certain size companies. But if you're familiar with GRC platforms, governance, risk, and compliance, one of the challenges is they're super for very large organizations. But for smaller organizations, they only cover a very small sliver of the problem that we're trying to solve. So you may get an auto-generated SSP. You may get an auto-generated SPRS score. You may get an auto-generated POAM. But I would suggest the more things that get auto-generated, kind of layered on top of one another, it becomes a bit of a house of cards. It's wonderful that there's some automation that can save you and your team, if you're lucky enough to have a team, some time. But truly, ultimately, having an SPRS score, an SSP, and POEMs, that's a part of the challenge and a part of the puzzle. But just having those will not get you fully compliant, and it won't make you fully secure. So one of the other things that we also found was that 7 in 10 respondents reported being NIST 800-171 compliant via their self-assessment. So 7 in 10 respondents said they were compliant And that completely tracks with my experience in talking to customers, and that customers who say, I think I'm good. We did our self-assessment. We think we're about a 110, or we're very close. And then what we find many times is if we do a gap assessment, we find a wild difference between an internally led assessment and an externally led assessment. And again, that's why when I was in your shoes and I had to go find a way to measure myself relative to what was at the time, again, a subset of NIST 853, I had to find a third party to create a scoring framework and do that assessment for me, because I knew that that was the best way to get a candid look at where we were and a real look at where we were. So for me to hear, and I think you've heard before from DCMA and John Ellis, that NIST 800-171, which is required by DFARS Clause 7012, it's in over 1 million contracts. So to hear that 7 in 10 respondents to this survey said they were compliant with NIST 800-171, as evidenced by their self-assessment, is kind of stunning, because you're going into a government database, you're attesting to your compliance, and there's contractual ramifications to that. You're going to hear that later today relative to False Claims Act concerns when we have the attorney who led that case. And so that really is stunning to me. Now, you've heard with CMMC 2.0 and a senior executive having to certify the results of SPRS. If that is to happen, I think that will greatly change the fidelity of the SPRS scores that are entered. Again, in past experience, one of the things on the classified side, where I had some responsibilities, we used to do an annual assessment and getting ready for the various agencies that would come in and grade us essentially against the NISBOM or any other document, depending on the classification level. And one of the disciplines we had at the time was the senior line of business president had to sign off on those results. And that drove a level of rigor that we previously didn't have. I think we're going to see the same thing happen in SPRS. When a senior official from a company has to certify those results, you're going to see a lot more tendency to go out to third parties like Cybersheet and others and say, hey, help me with this gap assessment. I think I know where I am, but I want your validation, because you're going to want a real look. I think once the executives have to start putting their signatures on things and certifying results, it's going to drive different behavior. And I think it's an important step in the maturity of cybersecurity. So there's all these data points to consider, and then there's your practical experience, right? So every company is in a different place in their journey to CMMC compliance. So I've shared some data and some statistics with you that may or may not better inform you of where you are relative to your competitors, but I think it probably does. And again, nobody's ever done this kind of research before. We're excited to share it actually with the Department of Defense, because I don't think they have this kind of data independently driven by a research organization like Merrill. So data is interesting, but it's irrelevant if it's not actionable, right? And so what can you do with these data points? And I think, again, it gets back to how we frame the problem at Cybersheet. Is we think that for a long time now, the Department of Defense has been consistent saying, go do 800-171. Again, that goes all the way back to 2015. And when you do that, we're going to give you a way to assess NIST 800-171A. There's plenty of materials out there on how to implement. And then from an ongoing perspective, you need to manage. You need to assess, implement, and manage. And so in doing that, what are some of the pitfalls that you should be aware of and you should avoid? Again, we want you to get out of this conference today and actionable things that you can take back to your company and use to get you further along in your journey to compliance. So I think it's obviously very important to take CMMC 2.0 compliance seriously. And that includes investing appropriate resources and not, doing things that, are ultimately pitfalls. And so I think you can easily overspend and undercomply. And I think the way you do that is some of the pitfalls that we've seen many times is to companies who try and license their way to compliance. So certainly there's software required and licensing is important. There's hardware required. but none of it is the silver bullet some providers make it out to be. So the licensing required, whether it's GCC high, which I think is frankly the biggest culprit that and is misunderstood in terms of whether or not it's actually required. It maybe should be one piece of your overall compliance puzzle, but in buying GCC high licensing, using that example, that doesn't deliver compliance. Nothing in the GCC high license is going to write your SSP. It's not going to conduct your gap assessment or your SPRS scoring for you. So it's an element of compliance. But again, you can overspend and under comply. So you have to be thoughtful and try not to license your way out of, into compliance. And so that's the one pitfall that I would highlight. Another one is to avoid tunnel vision. Look, CMMC is security focused, of course, but responsibility for a large part of cybersecurity often falls with the IT department. Many customers coming to us the first time have IT in their job title. And so many times there's an over focus on things like vulnerability management or deploying a SIM or implementing multi-factor authentication. But ultimately, if you only focus on security tools, your compliance efforts will fall short and they will be incomplete. You have to focus on the IT piece as well. And again, I think there's an IT component, there's a cybersecurity component, and then there's clearly a governance component. As you know, at CMMC, you need all three. So avoid the tunnel vision of just focusing on the security compliance requirements unless you know that's the only puzzle piece you're missing. And the final pitfall, I think you've heard this before, so I don't claim to kind of take ownership of this phrase, but the whole crawl, walk, run approach, it really can be done and should be done. And I think if those who try and run instantly end up overspending and under complying. So without a doubt, there's some great tools out there. There's some great compliance software that we talked about earlier that will help automate things like your SSP and your POAMs and automate your assessment scoring. And but these tools are a luxury, not a necessity. You don't need a tool to write your SSP. You don't need a tool to automate your assessment. It doesn't make you more secure. And I think, again, that should be the focus. So I think that no matter how great the tool is or the vendor marketing of the tool is, you still need to focus on the basics. And that is implementing all the controls. At the end of the day, again, I unabashedly give tremendous amount of credit to NIST and the Department of Defense, and frankly, many of you in the audience today who've contributed to NIST 800-171, because I think it does a great job of focusing on compliance and actual cybersecurity. And so you have to implement all the controls. And so writing your SSP and automating that doesn't implement anything. And so even the best governance, risk, and compliance tools can't do the implementation for you. So I think it's very important to understand that and recognize that. So the three pitfalls are: don't try and license your way to compliance. Can't. Avoid tunnel vision. Recognize that there's an IT component, there's a cybersecurity component, and there's a governance compliance component. And then crawl, walk, run, right? And so what does that mean practically speaking? Start with an assessment. Do your assessment. They've given you the baseline. They've given you a way to score yourself against the baseline. Do that first. Get into SPRS. Write your plan of action and milestones, and then start making progress. I can't tell you. You're going to hear from Stacy Bostjanek later today. You're going to hear from Jeff Dalton of the Cyber AB. You're going to hear from many people who also can't tell you today or aren't allowed to, or they just don't know what the actual deadline is. But the way, again, I take it as a practical, what can I do with that? Do I really need a deadline to get started? No, because we're already too late. This was a requirement in 2015. And just from a national security perspective, this is something we need. So again, crawl, walk, run. Assess yourself against the requirements, implement the requirements, and then manage those requirements and your ongoing compliance with those requirements over the long term. And I think that's the best thing that you can do now, and then you'll find yourself compliant when CMMC 2.0 is truly here. And the time to get started was probably many years ago, but also today. And so with that, again, I greatly appreciate your time today. I hope this was useful to you. And again, I hope you take away the progress that's been made and the performance that has been achieved here in these last 15 years. It's not hopeless for sure. We've made a tremendous amount of progress, and I'm very proud to be a small part of this public-private partnership that we've fostered together over all these many years, and I hope you are too. Thank you.